Welcome to the webinar, How to Accurately Identify Skill Gaps in as Little as 30 Minutes. So we're going to have a quick 30-minute webinar today. My name is Kirsten DeBrouwer. I'm the Training and Development Manager here at Capsule. For the past 30 years, Capsule has been using simulations and assessments to drive different experiential learning programs. And today we have with us Dr. Eric Deerdorf. Dr. Eric Deerdorf is a professor of management at the Dry House College of Business at DePaul University. Dr. Deerdorf is an award-winning instructor and has helped a wide variety of organizations to more effectively leverage their human capital through overall process redesigns, individual development and coaching, and evidence-based interventions using data science analytics. Dr. Deerdorf also serves as Capsule's Science and Innovation Advisor, where he supports product design and oversees validation research. All right, Eric, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Kirsten. I appreciate it. That's a nice intro. I have to live up to that. So I'm delighted, everyone, to spend some time with you today. And as advertised, we'll keep this discussion to 30 minutes or less and show you some ways to address skill gaps in as little as 30 minutes, too. A couple of quick logistics notes. The webinar is being recorded, so you can get a copy of that at the end. And there'll also be some contact information towards the end as well if you need to reach out to Kirsten about the webinar and other things we're talking about today. You know, before we get into this, I'd like to sort of just pose a question to you. Have you ever really wondered why we still have a skills gap? I mean, if you think about it, given the billions of dollars and the countless hours that are spent every year by colleges and corporations on training, it's kind of fascinating to think that we actually have the skills gap and why it might be so persistent. You know, and it often reminds me of this old but highly successful campaign around Got Milk. Some of you might have remembered this. You know, around the Got Milk, every time I would see this, I would ask myself, really? Wait, no, people aren't drinking milk? This is a thing? And so whenever I hear the skills gap argument or the comments around the skills gap, I get that same feeling. Really? There's a skills gap? But actually, it's quite robust, and it's a lot larger than we think. And so in today's short talk, I wanted to just kind of address 4 key questions with everyone. What skills gaps exist? Do these gaps even matter? Why do they exist? And then what should we do as learning and development professionals? What should we do first? And also I give a quick show and tell, if you will, of ways to address this early and often. So I know some of you might be thinking, you know, wait a second, I've already noticed a skills gap in my own organization, so tell me about this. I'm not very surprised by this. In fact, if you look to the recent report by the Association for Talent Development called Bridging the Skills Gap that was just released in 2018, the recognition that the skills gap exists becomes rather stark when you look at a couple key findings. So for example, 83% of the respondents reported a skills gap in their organization, and 78% expected that the skills gap will exist in the future. So if you step back and think about that, that means 4 out of 5 respondents indicated that it's a problem now and it will continue to be a problem in the future. And these same folks were asked, well, where are these gaps? Where are they occurring? And 3 key areas were identified where the largest skills gaps were occurring, and that's in communication and interpersonal skills, critical thinking and problem solving, and managerial and leadership skills. Sometimes we often refer to these, you know, with a blanket label of soft skills, quote unquote. It's interesting, if you think about these areas, these are sort of critical areas that L&D professionals are constantly trying to drive up talent and develop talent in their organizations. These same respondents in this report also were asked about the impact of these skills gaps. So these are the areas, what happens when we're not addressing these areas and there's a gap? And almost 3/4 remark that the skills adversely affects service delivery, customer experience, future growth. Essentially, these are key consequences for the organization overall, these key KPIs, if you will, for the organization. So it's really important to sort of remember, though, that skills gaps have these stark implications for organizations, but they also matter for individuals as well. You know, skill gaps are the primary derailers of long-term success for individuals. And there's a robust literature here that's studied this for quite a while. And what you're looking at right now is the results of 20 years of research of Fortune 500 companies trying to figure out why do people derail in their track to senior level positions. And 5 key themes emerge from this body of literature. And it's the idea that people struggle with interpersonal relationships, they fail to meet business objectives, there's the inability to lead and develop and lead a team, or the inability to adapt as well, or they're too functionally or technically oriented. So essentially, if you think about this, the way I like to talk about it, is that folks, people don't really like the people that are working. There's struggles with interpersonal relationships, so people don't like you. No one wants to work with you on the team, and you don't think you need to change. It's kind of the easy way, the blunt way of summarizing this to people. But that has real implications for L&D professionals, because not only does this matter for organizations, which we just talked about, but there are key struggles here or derailers for individuals in their long-term success. So this has consequences for our bench strength, whether we're thinking about upskilling folks or reskilling them to move into different jobs, different roles. These kinds of issues, these gaps have real-life implications for companies and the constituents within those organizations. Now, imagine at this point, some of you might be thinking, it's 2019 and this is still a problem. I mean, we're still writing reports on this. So many of you that have followed a lot of this sort of literature on skill gaps have known that these have been lamented for years. For at least a decade now, there's been numerous reports. Oftentimes they talk about these skill gaps in terms of 21st century skills. By numerous organizations have identified these gaps, ranging from SHRM and the Conference Board to the National Research Council, Educational Testing Service, just to give you some examples. And so the idea here is that, this is not necessarily something new, but there seems to exist a problem with it still. And if you go to the ATD report I was just referring to, gets a little bit of insight into some of the reasons why. So for nearly a decade, talent development professionals have overwhelmingly noted that at rates of 80% or higher, their organizations have a skills gap. This year's survey shows an overall decline in actions or resources being dedicated to addressing it. So if you think about that, it really sort of speaks to the idea, it suggests that part of the reason the skills gap still exists is there's a decline, a diminishing amount of resources and actions that are being focused towards addressing it. Instead, it's just sitting there and getting worse and worse and worse. And so, and also from this report, you say, well, who takes responsibility for this? So if resources are sort of drying up or at least declining over the years, who takes responsibility for this? So respondents also indicated that within their companies, 69% placed the sole or shared duty for resolving skills gaps on talent development departments. So many of you work in these departments who are on the call right now. And this actually increased in the last few years as well. One quick important point I'd like to note here is that the idea of sole or shared duty, that carries with it some really particular implications, because it highlights just how critical it is for L&D professionals to not only create direct interventions to address the skills gaps, but also to ensure that employees take ownership over their own learning. So it's a twofold issue here, developing those interventions as well as encouraging and helping people take ownership over their own development and own learning. Speaking of that, what we really want to get to is how do we mind the skills gap, right? So how do we begin to address this under the current constraints that exist for us? And so Kirsten and I have been doing this kind of work for collectively nearly 30 years. Actually a little over 30 years collectively. And so, with that kind of personal experience and combining that with the robust body of research on this, there are probably three key obstacles that L&D professionals face when they're trying to roll out direct interventions, as well as get people to sort of take ownership over their own development. And I just want to talk about these briefly because these are key to understand if you want to overcome them when you're trying to close the skills gap. We'll call it the wrong stuff, analytics allergy, and inaccurate insight. So by the wrong stuff, I imagine some of you might have read the book or seen the movie The Right Stuff. And one key thing in that movie or book, it talked about all the efforts, the development efforts that went into developing astronauts during the early space program. And to do this well, the extensive efforts, they had to really understand what they're supposed to develop and assess before they did it. So figuring out what those attributes were. And if you step back and think about all the money and time and effort you often spend in your own organizations on assessments, especially for developmental purposes, if you step back and think about that for a moment, I'd be willing to bet that the vast majority of your time and effort and money is spent on assessments that tap into personalities or styles, right? This is very common. From a developmental standpoint, however, these types of personal attributes don't give you as much bang for your L&D buck, if you will. So take it from a psychologist such as me. When you're dealing with adult learners, personality or styles are much, much less malleable or changeable than other personal attributes, right? And so the takeaway here is if you want a higher yield, a higher return on your investment when you're using assessments for developmental purposes, you really need to focus on the right attributes. In this case, knowledge and skill development. Knowledge and skills are much, much, much more likely to be malleable and changeable, and importantly, they are distinct from personality and styles. The second obstacle is this idea of analytics allergy. It's interesting with all the emphasis that's placed on people analytics in today's organizations, it's actually kind of surprising how little of that attention is being paid to the L&D side of things, the learning and development side of things. In fact, most of the attention on people analytics falls into the talent acquisition side of the house. And so really the obstacle here is trying to take those tools, those analytics tools, and integrating them into L&D efforts. And so what this really means is measuring the impact and monitoring the impact of our direct interventions. So in other words, at the point of intervention, are we moving the needle? Are people actually acquiring these skills? And then importantly, are they transferring these skills back to the job, right? Is it improving job performance, promotion rates, engagement, and so forth, right? And then finally, the third obstacle is this idea of inaccurate insight. And so the key word here is how can we build accurate self-awareness, right? Accuracy being that key term. And so I just want to spend a moment on this because this is one of the most significant obstacles and highest mountains to climb when we think about professional development in today's organizations. It's when we're dealing with inaccurate insight, a fundamental question might be, well, what's the prevalence of inaccurate self-awareness, if you will? And so researchers have been studying this for several decades, and the results are so incredibly consistent that two of the earlier researchers actually have their name on the effect. Basically, their last names are part of the effect. And the way this research usually goes is they'll ask you, how good are you at math? Or how good are you at public speaking? Or how good are you at speaking a foreign language or playing a musical instrument? And then you'll rate yourself. And then it'll be followed with an objective assessment, a math test. You'll stand up and deliver a presentation to a panel of experts. You'll play an instrument, these sorts of things. And then they'll look at the difference, the gap between your self-assessment and your objective performance. And the pattern's so consistent that they've named it the Dunning-Kruger effect. And you can see what the pattern looks like on the screen. So a couple things to note here, right? Because especially if you're looking at the green line, one of the key takeaways is you can see pretty much everybody puts themselves above average because 50th percentile is average. And it's not until you objectively are in that kind of top 25% do you begin to discount yourself, right? So clearly there's a tendency for people to overrate their skills and abilities. And the second key takeaway here is notice where the largest gap is, right, between self-ratings and actual capabilities. And that's towards the bottom. So if you think about this, the real implications for what we struggle with every day as L&D professionals is those folks that are in need of intervention the most are also the people who are the most unaware of their need for learning. And so that creates a real barrier, as something we need to address if we're trying to address the skills gap itself. And the impact of accurate self-awareness is rather robust. So what you're looking at here, just very quickly, the results of data from 69,000 managers. And you can see along the bottom axis, these are the number of competencies that managers would rate themselves compared to what other people would rate. And so if I said I was higher on one versus what everyone else said, and then on the vertical axis there is my actual leadership effectiveness. So as you can see, the fewer competencies I rate myself higher than everyone else, the more effective I actually am as a leader. Again, accurate self-awareness matters. And this also has strong implications for teams as well, right? Teams that are composed of people with more accurate self-awareness, therefore the teams have greater accurate self-awareness, make better decisions, they engage in coordination more often, and they more effectively manage conflict. So clearly there's some real implications here of overcoming these obstacles, in particular the idea of inaccurate insight. And so what we're really trying to get to here is the idea of how do we close the skills gap, right? The path towards closing the skills gap. And it really begins with first identifying the skills and the gaps. If you don't do that first, you're really making it difficult to try to close the gap in your organization because you won't know where to focus your efforts and how much needs to go into these different kinds of skills, right? So how proficient or what kind of lack of proficiency actually exists. And when we're thinking about using assessment or learning solutions to address the skills gap, we've been studying this for, at least 25 years. Any kind of tool or solution you use really needs to meet 4 key criteria for it to work well, to have true skill development. The first is that assessment or that learning solution really needs to require both knowing and doing. So we're talking about assessing skills or the application of key knowledge. It needs to foster accurate self-awareness, which we just talked about. So objective information, not just self-reports, which so much of our assessments comprise in organizations today. We need to deliver an engaging and relevant experience. So here we're talking about high fidelity, experiential approaches, things that are relevant to the person's job and their career. And last, but certainly not least, the fourth criterion is that these assessments, these learning solutions really need to provide actionable feedback. It needs to be specific, skill-based, developmental in nature, and very, very important, provide some guidance on how to actually apply this feedback, which often assessments fall short. And so with all these kinds of criteria in mind and these obstacles to overcome, I wanted to shift gears here and show you what an assessment tool that meets these criteria and can help close this gap might look like. And so with that in mind, I'm going to show you a little bit of this product that I've been using in executive education as well as in the university environment for quite some time, and it's called Capsule Inbox. It's actually a platform that Capsule's developed, and currently there are 4 versions of this platform that you can see here. One that taps into general management, people management, ethical decision making, and time management. So it's important to kind of note here, it is a platform. So these are existing versions, but there is the ability to also work with Capsule, like through Kirsten, to develop more customizable versions because it is a platform and that's possible. So some of you might be familiar with assessment centers, which are often used for developmental purposes. In assessment centers, there's often an exercise called an in-basket. And so as we look at this, you'll see Capsule Inbox is modeled after that type of exercise. I'm going to pop in and out of a couple different versions here to show you what it looks like. Note that this is not a full-scale, full-blown demo. I just want to kind of give you a feel for what this looks like and how it can be implemented. If you're interested in a full-scale demo, you can easily reach out to Kirsten, and I'm sure she'd be more than happy to schedule this with you and give an in-depth demonstration of the product. One quick note that ties back to what we talked about at the very beginning. The one thing that I find really useful for Capsule Inbox is that it can be completed in as little as 30 minutes.
Yep.
So there's that truth in advertising again. So I'm going to pop back out here and just show you a little bit of what this tool looks like. So what we're looking at right now is the general management version of Capsule Inbox. And all of these inboxes have the same format and flow, right? Just the content and the skills that are assessed are a little bit different, and the storyline and narratives are different. So here, participants will come in, they get a brief introduction. There's an introductory video you can play. It's also closed captioned, so it's ADA compliant. And it tells them a little bit about their experience, right? And so when they go through this after they want to watch the short 1.5-minute video, it takes them to a self-assessment. And as you might imagine, as we just talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect, this is really important to capture individuals' views of themselves, and so they can move around and sort of rate themselves or where they want to be, right? And so after they give themselves some ratings, then it talks a little bit about their role. And now each of the inboxes have a different kind of storyline. In the case of general management, you're assuming the role of a sales and operations manager. And the team that you work for is an Internet of Things company called Ubiquitools. It also talks about how many direct reports they have and so forth. And you can see some of the information here on screen. Talks a little bit about the company itself, the types of products, and so forth. It gives them a little bit of background information to set the stage for the role they're assuming. And so now I'm gonna pop out to a different version here. Okay. So once they go through this, and there's a very brief onboarding rehearsal they can do just to get them familiar with the interface itself, so they can click around and kind of understand how this thing works. Because the entire platform is designed to be self-directed, so you really don't have to be there to guide people through this. And so here now I'm jumping into the time management version. And in the time management version, the role you're assuming is as a freelance designer who has to manage all of these different kinds of clients and opportunities. You can imagine time management is really critical in that kind of situation. So it's a good narrative to use. And so it gives right before they enter, it gives a little bit more a setup around how it's a busy time of the year for you. Your emails have piled up. You grab your coffee. Now it's time to jump in there and start doing it. And so as you'll see here, as I enter in the actual exercise interface, this should look pretty familiar to people. It looks like a typical communication platform. So you'll see there's kind of three key areas. You have a list of emails over here, and if you click on one, the message pops up and you can read it in the reading pane. You also have some shared drive files on the left, right? So think of a cloud drive. And as you can see on the bottom right here, there's instant messages that also pop in. Here's someone welcoming me back from my long vacation, and also wishing me luck for my webinar that I'm going to deliver this afternoon. And so all the functionalities here to keep that high fidelity experience for people. They can flag emails when they're answered. They go into sent items and so forth, right? And so there's a whole series of emails. And as they're participating through this, emails are coming in, instant messages are popping in, and they're responding to all of these different aspects. So I'll just quickly click into one to give you a feel for what these look like. So here's an email from Jason Amen. It's a really important email. Basically, I've been selected as a preferred vendor, and he's looking to set up a conversation with me to talk about this potential new opportunity, this project. And so all the emails present these kinds of situations and requests to participants. Some require a response, some don't. Oftentimes, different emails are connected to one another. So here I read the email, and then I have different choices to make. As you can see, this requires a couple of different things. Because remember, this is time management. So someone's trying to schedule something with me. That means I probably need to pay attention to and figure out what is my current schedule. Do I even have room for this? Of course, I can always go over here and look at my schedule for today. As you can see how it pops up, right? See if I have room to schedule this call. And then I can reply back. So each of these kinds of emails try to present a situation that will elicit someone's skill level. So one more thing I should probably note here is that you'll notice that they're not open-ended responses. So people aren't necessarily typing in open responses. That's by design. Instead, they're choosing from a set of selections as the optimal answer. The reason why Capsule decided to not use open-ended responses for their current versions is one of efficiency and cost. So you can have open-ended responses, but that requires live raters to then go back in and judge and rate each of the responses. The natural language processing software, the AI out there, just isn't quite capable yet of doing this very, very well. And in addition, that kind of approach of open-ended responses adds significant cost to the assessment. In addition, having this kind of approach also allows for immediate feedback right upon completion. And so individuals work through these series of emails and IMs pop in. So here's a classic example, Elena telling me good luck to the webinar, drawing those great crowds. Again, I can choose to respond or not. Some of these things are distractors that they should kind of ignore, that are time wasters in this version. So there's a lot of different kinds of realistic situations that people are confronted with. And so people proceed through this on average. This particular version, time management, takes less than 30 minutes. The other versions all hover right around 30 minutes on average to do. And so once someone completes the assessment, they receive a feedback report. And so this one's from people management, which assesses those very same skills as general management, but also gives information around the sort of core activities around human capital management. All the feedback reports have some commonalities. They tend to present information graphically as well as text-based. They also explain what these numbers mean. You can see this person here scored in the 75th percentile, 78th percentile. And these, like all good developmental assessments, the data are presented in percentile form, so you know how well you do relative to the large database of thousands of people. This is a people management version of Capsule Inbox, so it's also giving people scores on these people management competencies like structuring work, acquiring talent, managing talent, rewarding performance. Because the different situations in people management put people in in scenarios that deal with these four kind of buckets of human capital management practices. As we scroll down, there's also a self-awareness index that compares how accurate you rated your assessments at the beginning compared to how well you scored in the inbox. And then also gives some scores that show skill gaps as well, right? And so this person here, as you can see, they were pretty darn accurate in rating their own skills, a little undervalue themselves here for organizing, but most of the other ones, they were rather close. With initiating skills, they thought they were a little bit better than what they assessed. Mm-hmm. I just want to show you one more thing that's pretty fascinating about this. When they click next, it takes them to the next screen here. I think it's loading up. Okay. All right, I'm just waiting for it to pop up here. All right. Oh, look at that. That's interesting. Okay. So on the very next screen, I'll have to talk my way through this. On the very next screen, it'll show the list of skills. Mm-hmm. And in the list of skills, you can choose which skill you want to improve. And when they do that, it explodes out a long list of developmental tactics that are derived from evidence. So it'll tell them a little bit how to learn about the skill, how to practice the skill, followed by evidence-based tactics that they can begin to apply immediately to their own development. And once they choose to improve a particular skill, that'll lead them through what we call individual development plan builder. So a structured process where they're answering questions that helps them build a SMART goal and identify action plans and apply those developmental tactics. Okay. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a feel for what this might look like. Again, if you're interested in a full-blown demo and a chance to sort of really play around with this, please reach out to Kirsten. She's more than happy to give you that information. Mm-hmm. Kirsten?
Thank you so much, Eric. So we do have different versions, as Eric quickly mentioned, and I'm more than happy to walk you through any of these versions. Now, we do have a second part to this webinar, which we're going to be running on June 20th at 1 p.m. Now that you have identified those skill gaps, how do we close those skill gaps? So the webinar is called How to Effectively Close the Skill Gap. It's upskilling, reskilling, and everything in between on June 20th at 1 p.m. There is a link available. I'm going to be emailing everyone after this webinar, and I will include that link in that email so that you can register there if you would like. We are also at, one final surprise. It's so exciting. So you got a quick peek of the time management version, but we have registered everyone who registered for the webinar to go through time management for a free session themselves. It's a free license. So all you have to do is go to capsule.com, use the email you used for the webinar, and log in with the password TIME2019. Don't worry about writing this down. I'm going to include all of this in an email to you after the webinar. And if you are having to go to the ATD International Conference and Expo, we are there at booth 2501. Come by and say hello. We'd love to talk to you further. If not, if you're going and you'd like to talk before or afterwards, or if you're not going, let's have a conversation. Here's my email address, or you can give me a call at 312-477-7256. So I'll be shooting an email out today with the information about your free time management license, and also some information about the second webinar that we're going to be running in just about a month. Thank you so much, Dr. Deardorff, for your time today to talk about how to identify these skill gaps, and thank you so much for attending.